So, core human factors ergonomics standards, part 3 of this presentation. There are a number of them, and in particular, they're listed here. There's really 8 ones that are fairly important to human factors ergonomics, and I want to talk about each of them. The MIL standard, ISO ergonomics standards, and that are the responsibility of Technical Committee 159. The AMI standard, Human Engineering Standard 75, a standard of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, work of ANSI, in particular HFES Standard 100, the NASA handbook and the standards there, the FAA standard, and many standards that OSHA has. I just want to talk about them briefly. That's the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. I want to comment or follow on that there are many, many other standards that exist from the federal government and so forth. Covering them is well beyond what I can do in the brief time frame here. I'd really like to focus on these 8 major ones that really kind of predominate what we do. So one other item I want to mention before I go into the details of standards is there's this really interesting publication from the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Actually, there's 2 of them. And they provide an overview of some of the standards I'm going to talk about. And they also have, as shown here, information like snippets of the table of contents to give you a sense of the technical content of these. And in fact, what they do, which is really nice, is so if you're interested in the topic of displays, what they do is across these documents, they indicate which sections of the table of contents cover that topic. And that's very helpful if you're trying to find something and you're not sure which document to look at. Here's just an enlargement of that so you can see it a little bit more easily. So for example, for the topic of displays, there's the general principles, simplicity, usability, feedback, and system status. Here's what's in ISO 9241, one of their standards. And you can see that the headings are often different between these documents. It's not because the content may necessarily be different, just how they're arranged. So with that, let me start by talking about Military Standard 1472. The latest version is Edition G. This document, as you can see, has been revised over time if you're at version G. And it's sort of the Bible. This is what people who are doing human factors work use. I should first indicate how you find this document. All right, so, lest I forget, Revision G is the most recent version. It's a very comprehensive document. It's 381 pages long, and it's the minimum standard for human factors. So what I want to emphasize is that if something meets Military Standard 1472G, it doesn't mean it's good. It just means it meets minimum requirements. There are a number of areas where it's not very strong, as indicated here. So the coverage of HCI, human-computer interaction, is not that strong. The literature on biomechanics is not that good. And there are other topics as well. So don't take it as the only source of information, but it is certainly a good one. Now, people will say, I'm not designing a weapons system. Why should I worry about a standard put out by the Department of Defense? And the reason is because there are many requirements in there that you'll see that go well beyond defense systems, and that's the reason why it's often used. It's available, it's free, it's comprehensive, the data are pretty solid, and so that's why people use it. And the Defense Department continues to maintain it. So again, it's online and it's free, and so the question is, how do you get to it? So I'm going to do this using PowerPoint tools, but it may be shown at other times going to the actual website, and you can use that as well. So the current strategy is to go to quicksearchdla.mil. That is the Defense Logistics Agency website. That's where it's housed right now. And to use their quick search tool, and basically what you want to do is either type in the name, MIL Standard 1472, abbreviated as MIL-STD 1472, or possibly search for the heading Human Engineering. And again, to emphasize, it's the DLA site that we're interested in. And the other strategy is you can actually Google MIL Standard 1472G PDF, and that may get you to it as well. This is a case where actually Google works pretty well. So where you find 1472 has changed over time depending upon which agency is responsible for it. Again, currently the strategy is to use the Defense Logistics Agency website. So it's got basic information. What are some examples of the kinds of information that you'd find in MIL Standard 1472? All right, so there are general requirements having to do with safety, make things simple and easy to use, a lot of motherhood statements that are actually valuable. And then there's a great deal of detailed information, and this is what predominates in the document. So for example, there's information on how you should move a control so that a particular display moves in a direction it's intended. If you're having a visual display, how big should what kinds of lights should be used? How should large screens be designed? And how should head-up displays be designed? Of course, for head-up displays and a lot of things that are in the MIL standard, there are additional standards that have more details. For auditory displays, how should things be formatted? Controls, how should they be designed? Labeling, physical accommodation, how far can people reach? How big do openings need to be so people can get access to them? Requirements for lighting levels, for noise levels, for acceptable vibration, and so forth. So to give you a sense of that document, just let me pull up one or two random pages to show you what's in there. So here's an example for thumb wheel dimensions. So if you were designing a thumb wheel, here's the desired width, here's the exposure area, here's information on spacing, and here's an example from that of one page saying, for example, there ought to be 25 millimeters of the rim that should be exposed, the rim should be at least 3 millimeters or approximately 1/8 of an inch wide, and so forth. So this is just capturing one page of many hundreds of pages of detailed information. Here's another example of something that's physical, namely a ladder. So if you're having a ladder, this might be, of course it could be on board a ship, but it could be in a refinery or some other place where people need a ladder. So the question is, what's the information on the distance that the ladder needs to be from a vertical surface so that when you put your foot in, there's room for it? Should be the width of the ladder, the inside and the outside, what should be the spacing of the rungs, and so forth. So all kinds of information that one might need if one was designing a ladder to be safe and easy to use. Another example is head-up displays. I want to emphasize it's head-up. Displays, not heads-up, because you only have one head. Here's an example of the detail in there is about windshield transmission rate, which they said shall be not less than 70%. The eye box, how big should the eye box be? And the dimensions are given. And I want to comment that this is for military applications, so this eye box is a little small. Again, remember, these are minimum requirements, so something like a passenger car would need a much bigger eye box than you might need in, say, a helicopter or other aircraft. The standard also covers physical comfort, and so here's an example of a psychrometric chart that indicates comfort zones. There's wet bulb temperature, dry bulb temperature, and other information here. And so if you're trying to make an assessment of thermal comfort, using the requirements in the MIL standard is a start, but again, it's a minimum, not necessarily what's desired. Within the International Standards Organization, there are a number of places where human factors and ergonomics work happens. I mentioned earlier Technical Committee 22, and in fact, there are many other applications where human factors activities occur. However, the central activity is within Technical Committee 159, whose name is Ergonomics. So let me give you a sense of the groups within ISO TC 159 and what they're doing. So there's a Chairman's Advisory Group. There's a special working group on ergonomics for people with special requirements. Then there are a number of subcommittees. So Subcommittee 1 is General Ergonomics Principles. They are interested in principles, obviously, mental work, and process standards. Second within there is the Subcommittee 3, which is Anthropometry and Biomechanics. Anthropometry is human body size, strength, and range of motion. And so there's kind of an overall anthropometry working group, and then there's a working group with human strength, and in particular they're focused on manual materials handling. In addition, there's Subcommittee 4. Subcommittee 4 is concerned with human-system interaction, and you can see there's a large number of working groups within Subcommittee 4. So visual display requirements, human-centered design processes, so this has to do with primarily interactive computer systems, haptic feedback, and so forth. So let me talk a little bit more about some of these committees. I want to focus on a little bit Subcommittee 5, which is the ergonomics of the thermal environment. So, or that primarily it concerns physical environment, with thermal environments being the big issue that they tend to focus on. Again, they're integrative environments. And then there's this working group for people with special requirements. Remember, there was also a committee level working group as well for that purpose. So this technical committee, 159, has produced many standards. I just want to kind of give you a list, a sense of what there is in the list. You can obviously, as I did earlier, go to the technical committee webpage in the ISO.org site and look at the full list, but I want to give you just a quick sense of what's out there. So there's some general ergonomic principles. And here's an example of some of the documents that have been produced by that subcommittee. So design of work systems. One that I think is fairly important is definitions related to mental workload. So the definitions are useful, but the details are not as good as we'd like. But nonetheless, if somebody's doing work on workload, then one should at least look at ISO 10075. And there's some other kind of general documents, which is consistent with the title, put out by that technical committee and subcommittee. Here's Subcommittee 3, which is anthropometry and biomechanics, and their list is quite extensive, and the information they provide is much more detailed. So there's a document on working postures, ISO 226, a document on manual materials handling, 228, issues of related to patient handling in healthcare, that's a technical report, 12296, anthropometry for designing machinery, like presses and lathes and drill presses and so forth, that's ISO 14738. So you can see the list of documents that they've created is quite extensive. And again, this is only a subset. These are examples, not the full set of what they've produced. Here's Subcommittee 4, which is ergonomics of human system interaction. And some notable ones are the design of control centers, ISO 11064. So if one is designing control centers, you need to worry about that. And what I put in parentheses is an indication of the extent of that document. This is not just one standard, but actually 7 different parts. So if you're designing control centers, you really need all 7 parts. Usability methods, ISO 16982. Clearly, those that are interested in human-computer interaction should know about and have read this document. Ease of operation of products, design characteristics, ISO 20282-1. Notice that there are many topics that are covered here that could in fact be covered in 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 standards that are somehow related to each other. And here's one that's of interest to ISO, to folks interested in product usability, 2082-2, which is the summative test method. So if you're doing procedures, it's very, very important to have access to these ISO documents. The largest document that's put out by this committee is ISO 9241. Now, 9241 is not one document, one standard, but probably close to 100 at this point. So originally they started out by having ISO 9241- and a single-digit number, and then the list expanded, so it became a 2-digit number, and then the list expanded further as they split some of these documents up, and it became a 3-digit number. And so this just gives you a sense of some of the topics that are covered in ISO 9241. Keyboards, menus, the design of forms, web interfaces, visual displays. So visual displays are covered in many places. And so this makes getting your job difficult because you need to figure out which ISO 9241 version, which standard or implementation of 9241 you need to get. And literally, as I said, they're probably close to 100 at this point. The next ISO subcommittee I want to mention in Technical Committee 159 is Subcommittee 5, Ergonomics of the Physical Environment. And so here again you see an example of some of the things that they're interested. WBGT is wet bulb globe temperature, auditory danger signals, speech communication, visual warnings, auditory and danger warnings, thermal environment in vehicles, which relates obviously to the work of Technical Committee 22, Subcommittee 39, and accessible design. So the topic of accessible design and dealing with people with physical limitations is covered in many, many documents. So these are all in bold because I think they're all useful. What I've tried to do by bolding them is to give you a sense of some of the documents that I think are most useful, but please don't take the perspective that's the only thing useful. There are many, many documents here that are useful to you. Right, so as I've indicated several times, it's really difficult to know in advance what's going to be most useful. Yes, you can get a preview, but the preview only shows the introduction, the definitions, and the references, and it doesn't give you a sense of the meat of the document. And they're doing that because they don't want people to just look at them online, copy them, and then not pay the fee. And that's important to ISO and other standards organizations because they exist to a large degree based on sales of standards. So if they don't sell them, there are no standards to produce because there's no support for the organization. Also note that they are costly, and it's not unusual for a document to cost $5 or $10 per page. Here's an example of one document, ISO 245500, Accessible Design. It's only 7 pages long, but it costs 58 Swiss francs, which at the moment, it's $58.17. So again, sometimes you can look at the preview and get a sense of what it's about. So for example, here's a preview of ISO 245, the 2010 edition. I've truncated it to give you a sense of what's there. And so the question is can you tell from only this information whether or not it's useful? Sometimes the answer is yes. Unfortunately, in my experience, the answer is often no. So that means you need to talk to somebody who's been involved in these standards and knows about them, and that they can give you some recommendations about the value of them. It's not good if you go to your supervisor and say, I'd like $1,000 for standards, and you find that only 2 of them are extremely useful. That's just unfortunately the way it is until somebody comes up with a better system to give us a sense of what's out there. Next document I want to talk about is AMI HE75, which is also an ANSI standard. Here's the location that you'll find this document online. It is a standard associated with human factors engineering of medical devices. And it's AMI, as a side note, stands for the Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation. A point I want to make about this standard, and I will make about many others, is that even though it seems like it's focused on a specific application, so MIL Standard 1472, you think only military systems. AMI, you'd think only it's medical devices. In fact, there's a lot of information in these standards that applies to other contexts. So if it's well done and has good information, it might apply elsewhere. A good example in AMI is there's lots of information about connectors. For example, the issue of the problem might be you plug an air line into an oxygen line or vice versa and have problems. So information on how to prevent those kinds of mistakes by design is an important part of the AMI document and would have application beyond the design of medical devices. So this AMI document complements another document, which is IEC document 62366, which has to do with usability of medical devices, and that came from an AMI document. It's not cheap. It's $300 for 445 pages. Fortunately, those of academia, for example, at the University of Michigan, because of the way the library is set up, have free access to it by our library server. So what's in there about medical devices and and how is it useful to both medical and non-medical applications. Here's an example of part of the table of contents. So there's information on general principles. You'll pretty much find that in every document. And the sort of general principles to worry about: managing risk, how to deal with usability testing, documentation, packaging. Packaging is not dealt with, for example, in the MIL standard because it's just not an issue. Whereas if you're dealing with medical products or drugs, they are packaged. So the question is, how should those bottles, containers, and so forth be designed? Post-market, again, they're dealing with products. Cross-cultural, that's a big issue because medical applications are international, they're not just natural. And obviously alarm design is a big issue in operating rooms and patient rooms and so forth. Here's some other information that's in there. Obviously accessibility is a big deal, it's very important. The design of controls, visual displays, and this is pretty much any one of these standards. Software user interface, hand tool design, because we're interested in various kinds of medical devices. Home health care, that's something that's unique to this document and not in others. As indicated here, there's information and references that just are not found elsewhere that are in HE 75. So for example, there's information on color coding, and what's interesting is how is color coding dealt with in different countries. If you're designing something for the international market, you need to know the impact of choosing a particular color and its cultural significance in those countries. You may not know that unless you've grown up there or lived there for some period of time. The other document that I mentioned is IEC 62366, which has to do with application of usability engineering. That's a somewhat shorter document, not cheap, $200. And here are some of the topics that are covered in it. So whereas HE 75 might give, for example, some number for some issue related to a medical device, this particular document focuses on the process. How do you create a usability trial, for example? And that's covered in great detail there. And how do you do particular analyses? Another valuable thing that's in there are some terminology that you might want to use and try and figure out how to use them correctly. So, for example, what's the distinction between harm, hazard, risk, something being safe and unsafe, dangerous? In legal situations, these terms come up a lot, but if you're preparing something for the FDA or for some other organization, you'd want to make sure that you use the proper terms, because there's a distinction between how we might use them in popular discussions and their technical meaning. Next topic I'd like to cover is New Reg 0700. New Reg 0700 is put out by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and it has to do with human interface design. Now, one would think that this only pertains to nuclear power plants, but in fact there's a great deal in there that pertains to process control in general. So therefore, if somebody was designing a refinery or even a factory where a process is ongoing, information that's in New Reg 700 will be extremely useful. Here's the URL for where you can get it, and what I want to emphasize is that this document is free. It's 545 pages long. It's extremely well referenced. And that's really a strength of this document, that when a specification is given, you can figure out where the ideas, the support, the technical information that's relevant to it came from. What I'd like to do is to provide a few examples from New Reg 0700 to give you a sense of what's in it. Again, I can't cover 545 pages effectively in a few slides, but at least I can give you a sense of its content. All right. So obviously in process control, the question is, how do you show what the process is? So there's a section 1.2.8 that talks about mimics and diagrams. And so here's an example of a diagram. And this gives you just a quick idea of just one or two points that are shown in here to give you a sense of it. This number is the number of references. And there are literally thousands of references in this document. So the question is, how should you show a mimic, and what is the appropriate way to do it? And here's an example. Obviously, there's much more, and I can only show you one slide here to give you one sort of brief idea of what's contained. There's a lot of information about color, and when you read the information about color, typically all you get is this information, the name of the color. But what they've done is given you the Munsell coordinates of that color, which is useful. So that if you want to specify a color, you want to specify it more precisely than red, because red can be many different things. And of course, it's not merely the coordinates of the color, but in the color space, what is the range of colors that's acceptable? Another item that's unique to New Reg 0700 is what's known as the specification of color contrast, delta E. The ability to see text or graphics or other visual information depends upon both the luminance contrast between the character and background, or a graphic and a background, and its color contrast. Luminance contrast is often defined and specified. Color contrast is not commonly done, but New Reg 0700 does it. And here's the equation for color contrast or chromatic contrast. And the final point to make here is that New Reg 0700 covers quite a few topics that are simply not in the mill standard. So you think about, you're interested in something like the process control information or other information. I've just given you a few examples. If you can't find it in the mill standard, look at New Reg 0700. And good examples of that are things related to human-computer interaction, which, as previously I said, was a weakness of the mill standard. That may change when revision H comes out. HFES 100 has to do with the human factors engineering of computer workstations. It can be purchased from the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society, and here are some of the topics that it covers. What you'll notice is some of the topics overlap with what you've seen in ISO documents and other documents. One, you don't know at the outset whether ISO requirements will be specified, the ANSI HFES requirements, or others. There's also an HFES 200 standard. Here's some of the issues it has to do with software user interfaces. It's not clear long-term what the support will be for continuing work on HFES 200. It may simply be frozen and no additional work will be done on it, because the activities may be focused on other standards such as those from ISO. Next time I want to talk about is the NASA Human Integration Design Handbook. Here is the location where it would be found, and this replaces NASA Standard 3000. Again, to give you a sense, I should comment that, again, we have another extensive document, more than 1,000 pages long, and here are some of the topics that are covered in the Human Integration Design Handbook. The structure is consistent with many others. There's an introduction, general requirements, then the topics of anthropometry and biomechanics are covered, human performance, natural and induced environments. And then the thing that's unique about this one is that obviously NASA is interested in space flight and movement in environments that are sort of not what we typically experience. So there's a lot of information on habitability, which is important to NASA. Crew interfaces is interest, and obviously EVA activities are unique to NASA. What I want to comment, though, is that habitability issues that NASA deals with in spacecraft will also be important for other environments that are constrained. For example, if one was designing a submarine, then many of the things that are relevant to spaceflight, again, are relevant to submarines. It's closed off from the environment. The space is limited. The time period you're in the environment is quite long. So information about habitability that NASA puts out has application to other contexts. Here's an example of some of the information from that NASA document, Standard 3001. So here are ultrasonic sound limits. So the focus traditionally was on things people can hear, but not things people cannot hear. And so here are, you notice it's all very low frequency, And here's the intensity levels that should not be exceeded. Again, this is in this document and not in other documents that I know of that are kind of general towards the topic of human factors. Then obviously if you're interested in space flight, you're interested in a crew and how a crew works together. So issues of teaming are very important to NASA 3047. So therefore what you're going to find is a lot of information about what makes for a good team. Now this is not what you might traditionally think of as human factors because it's not a physical equipment issue, but it does have to do with how the work is organized and how people work together to use the equipment and systems that are provided. And then finally, there's information in this document on mechanical hazards, and there are a few things in there that I just not have found anywhere else. And here's one small example about how you put a curve on a surface to, if a person bumps against it, to avoid injury. Almost any product you'd want to design, people may have to handle, and if they have to handle it, you don't want to have sharp edges that can injure them. Where's the number that tells me what the characteristics of that edge should be? Here they are in this NASA document. All right. Also, I mentioned earlier NASA 3001, which is a related document, and this has to do with crew health and maintaining crew health. So here's the source for it. It's somewhat shorter. It's only 83 pages long. It has to do with medical care and so forth. This is a topic that's not covered in many other general human factor standards, and it's for that reason that I bring it to your attention. There's a second volume, and that's associated with habitability, environmental health. Again, these are issues that pertain primarily to NASA and space flight, but are issues that are important in all kinds of hazardous environments. There's some questions about its overlap. Here's the place where you can get it for free, and it's 196 pages long. And here's just, again, some additional information that what's in that second volume. So physical characteristics, perception and cognition. Obviously, again, induced environments and habitability are important to NASA. And again, other topics that are similar to what I talked about earlier. Obviously, space suits is a NASA-specific topic. So it's similar to what's in 3047. Another document that's important is the FAA design standard. Again, this is another one that's free. It's 739 pages long. The latest version is 2016. If you talk to people, they refer to it as HFDS. And it's fairly easy to apply, and again, here's the website for where this document can be obtained. Here's a partial indication of the table of contents. So pretty much every one of these standards starts out with a general section. It covers automation, which is not a topic that's covered in many other documents. Automation is important because it's quite common in aircraft. So the question is, how do you design for automation? And another issue that's important to aircraft is maintenance. A lot of time and money is spent maintaining an aircraft to make sure it will fly well. Well, how do you design an interface, a device, a system, so that it's easy to maintain? Printers is, again, something unique to the FAA design standard. Other topics, human-computer interaction, keyboard, you'll see elsewhere. And then finally, other topics that you've seen before, workstation design, issues about environment, anthropometry and biomechanics. And again, one that's unique to the FAA document is documentation and how you design it. So here is something about the documentation chapter. So here's an example of the wording that's in one requirement about not using negative wording. And of course, the nice thing it provides a source for where that came from. So if you have some questions about it, you can go and read the original resource. This is something that not many standards do, but I found time and time again is useful to help clarify and understand where the specification came from, and indeed if it's valid given current technology. And of course, not only do they give you the requirement, but they give you an example of what to do. I found that examples are often very helpful. Another section in the FAA document is anthropometry, and in particular, they do have a lot of information on wheelchair users. They're trying to make sure that the population that maintains aircraft and has other support functions can, in fact, perform those tasks. OSHA. OSHA is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. They're an organization that's active in the United States. It's a U.S. government function. They're responsible for enforcing safety and health laws. Other countries have similar organizations. OSHA has a list of workplace standards, and in contrast with some of these other documents, these are legal requirements that with which companies, organizations, and individuals must comply. Here's an example of some of the sections in that document. Again, OSHA requirements are somewhat different than others. They cover different topics. So walking surfaces is covered, for example, in the MIL standard, but not in the depth that OSHA does it. Ingress and egress is also covered, but again, not in the same depth. In OSHA, they're required of persons, for example, cleaning a tank with chemicals in it that might be hazard to the individual. They want to make sure that if there's a problem, that the person can get out on their own quickly or they can be rescued readily. And again, these are topics that you would find very much in an industrial situation, which is the focus of OSHA activities. In addition, there are a number of other sections that are in this particular document that are not addressed elsewhere. So for issues, for example, of compressed gas, manual materials handling, welding, and so forth, again, that are not in any of the other documents that I just mentioned, because they're really the focus of the work that OSHA carries out. The most important part of the OSHA standard, however, is what's known as the General Duty Clause. And as one is doing engineering, one needs to keep in mind what the General Duty Clause says. And that is that the employer needs to make sure that the workplace is free of recognized hazards. And that's important because a lot of times there is no specific requirement to take care of a particular problem. But nonetheless, if it's a recognized hazard, as said here, that causes death or serious injury, then it needs to be dealt with. And here's just an example of a specific requirement from the OSHA document, just to give you a sense of the level of detail and content of it. So this happens to do, for example, with danger signs. And of course, what it does is, as in many of these cases, it cites another document, ANSI Z 53.1, which I believe now has been superseded by 535.1. So that gives you a sense of the activities that OSHA is carrying out and the documents that they use to support their activities. Let me summarize what I've just talked about in this part of the presentation. So there are 5 take-home messages. First, standards go by many names. I've talked about standards, guidelines, and other names that are used. So just because it's not called a standard doesn't mean it isn't one. Remember, the key distinction is whether the document by name or by content has things you should do or you shall do. One of the critical problems is you read a document and it's unclear. It might say check something. Is check a should or a shall or neither? Second point is standards are developed by many, many different organizations. I've highlighted ISO. I've also talked about the development process, trying to make the process public and trying to get consensus. This is an extremely time-consuming process. In the case of ISO, the maximum allowed time is 3 years, and many, many standards take 3 years to develop because it takes time to get international experts together, to get all the relevant technical information together, to get agreement on what it should be, and finally to write it in a manner that's understandable. And after all that, to make sure that you have public comment so that the document that results is truly reflective of the science and evidence available. Next is, how do you find these documents? And the point I wanted to make is it's just not easy. Yes, you could look at some standards tool, but unfortunately the way that most people do it is they go to the website of the organization that's generating standards and literally search through trying to find the relevant technical committees, subcommittees, and then the standards that they are producing. So it is not an easy process, and support by Google is just not as strong as it could be. Maybe that will change in the future. I've identified a large number of standards that are central to human factors practice. There are far more than you could ever really know. The key ones are the 8 that I identified in the presentation, this presentation. These are kind of the big ones, the ones that have the most influence, but clearly they're not the only standards you need to know about. Again, in summary, MIL Standard 1472, version G currently, H to come out sometime in the future, is the Bible. If you have one standard you must have, it's 1472. AMI HE 75 is concerned with medical devices, but again, as with many standards, there are things in there that are applicable to things other than medical devices that you might find useful. New Reg 0700 is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. That's concerned with process control. But as I mentioned, there are things like documentation in there that are useful to many, many other applications. FAA standard has to do with the aircraft flight and maintenance. ISO 9 has many, many, many standards, of which 9241 is most important. And again, 9241 has something on the order of 100 parts. HFES, the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society, has 2 standards having to do with workplaces. 100 will continue to be important. It's unclear in the future what will happen to 200. NASA's Human Interface Design Handbook is useful. Again, it's focused on space activities, but there are many situations where what's in the NASA handbook is useful. And finally, I've talked about OSHA's work and workplace standards. So to pull this together, again, the key point is these are the 8 documents that are most important, but don't get the sense that the only ones. There are just a huge number, in some cases many hundreds or thousands, that could be relevant to what you do. So what are some important things to keep in mind when designing and using and evaluating standards? And the most important thing is they need to be consistent. The documents need to make the requirements apparent. So a lot of times people use the word should and shall, but if they use other words, it's not clear what is meant. And the check, prevent, look for, watch out for, without words should or shall, is a good example of where what the requirements are is uncertain. Standards are important because they save time and money, and I think I made that point in the very beginning of part 1, where I talked about international containers and how they really had been positive in encouraging international trade and travel. When things are designed and evaluated in a consistent manner, that means that each organization does not need to create their own test methods, and it saves time and money. So people think of standards as being limiting, and in fact, in many contexts, that's not the case. They help get the process going and get it going in an efficient and cost-effective manner. Human factor standards, and those concerned with ergonomics, often lead to product systems and services that are safer, easier to use, and more enjoyable. This is an important thing that we need to do, and that's why I've given this presentation to help you make systems and products better and easier to use. So we're concerned both about productivity, but also well-being of the individual. Both are important. So hopefully this gives you a good sense of the subject of human factors and ergonomic standards. Should you have additional questions or feedback, please feel free to contact me. My phone number is shown here. And in addition, my email address. And if you're looking for other materials and documents that I've produced, feel free to look at the website from my research team. 2 organizations have contributed to the development of this work. First is NIST. I want to recognize their work. We had a contract with them to produce the PowerPoints and materials associated with it. In addition, I'd like to thank Michigan Nexus from the College of Engineering for helping to produce these videos to serve as adjuncts to the Human Factors Engineering short course. For those of you that are interested in that particular course, you can Google it by typing University of Michigan Human Factors Engineering short course or Center for Ergonomics or other information. I should comment, in addition to the short course, the Center for Ergonomics supports other courses as well on the topic of ergonomics. So thank you for listening.